So hey GDC, thanks for coming. I'm Bob De Schutter. I'm a Belgian game designer and professor at Miami University of Ohio. And I'm currently working on a game called Brukel about my World War II surviving grandmother. But my main line of research that we'll be talking about today concerns games and aging. Now, you might know me from such previous GDC talks as Beyond Ageism, Designing Meaningful Games for Older Adults, and, well, I really only did that one, so. But that was last year. So could you raise your hand if you were here last year so I have some idea? Ooh. All right, thanks for coming back, guys. And sorry? It was awesome. Thanks, Jeremy. Love you, man. So, all right. So today we're going to do the sequel, really, to my talk from last year. So to give you a quick idea what I talked about back then, I basically summed up 12 years of research, my own research, that of others as well, in a 50-minute primer that taught you everything you needed to know to design great games for older audiences. And specifically this guy, which is a picture of me if I'm, older. Now, I crammed a lot of different topics in that talk, and people really seemed to like it, especially Jeremy. But there was this one question that I really couldn't answer. It was, what about VR, Bob? And yeah, what about it? You see, a lot of the material that I talk about comes from academia. And to be honest, there were a lot of articles with the term VR in the title. But all of them were by very ambitious academics who used the term to refer to things such as the Nintendo Wii, the Microsoft Kinect, even Dance Dance Revolution inspired dance games for seniors. Yeah, that actually exists. So technically, that's not really incorrect to talk about VR to refer to these things because they all simulate your presence in a virtual environment. But they're obviously not the latest and greatest consumer VR that had got everybody so excited about last year. So all things considered, last year there wasn't really that much literature on audiovisual VR games for older adults out there. And that obviously meant that I really couldn't give you my opinion on the topic since I do need some supporting research to do so. After all, despite the many clear similarities, I'm not a counselor to our president, and while there's definitely some opinion in this talk, I don't deal in alternative facts. All right. So, all joking aside, we're a year along since then, and my team has conducted some informal tests, an exploratory study, a lit review. We asked around in the industry, and I've been able to update last year's talk for VR. So, let's get started and talk about VR for older audiences. So, last year I started the talk revealing how older adults, as in 50-plus-year-olds, are going to be a huge segment of the gaming market. And I got that from making a projection. I combined numbers from the United Nations and the Pew Research Center, which is a nonpartisan think tank, and I made a bold claim that by 2045 we could see up to 105 million US gamers over the age of 50. Now, that claim is still supportable today. Pew did a new study and they found that players over 65 even went up from 24 to 25%, and the United Nations didn't release any new numbers. Now, these demographics are about games, obviously. They're not about VR. So again, what about VR, Bob? Well, that's still pretty much up in the air. I only found data about older adults being interested in VR, which doesn't really specify games, and it kind of makes sense if you think of it because the technology is still so new. So anyway, I got these two surveys. YouVisit reported that 14% of 65 wants to try VR, and Touchstone Research reported that 64% of baby boomers are interested in VR. Now, these numbers are clearly pretty far apart, but I'm leaning towards the latter, and I'm going to go on a limb here and state that I think that the interest is definitely there. I personally found it way easier to convince older adults in my own research to play the VR games than that it was for them to play the regular games, and I've been doing this for a couple of years. For reasons such as folks, having seen it on television, or they might have seen VR ages ago and wanted to see how it evolved, or a lot of people just wanted to impress their grandkids and so on. So that's one reason why I think that there's definitely an initial interest for VR games there. A second reason is a report by Slice Intelligence that I saw. These guys are actually sponsoring the GDC and have a booth here as well. And they had a sample of 70,000 buyers of Pokemon Go virtual goods. And 20% of those 70,000 people were older than 55. So I know it's not VR, it's AR, but in my opinion, it does show that a somewhat similar technology can find an older audience successfully, and more importantly, an older audience that's willing to pay for it. So considering the demographics when looking at PC games and mobile games, there is definitely a substantial audience of 50-plus-year-olds. And I do see some indications that this will grow into a VR audience in the same way that we see with younger audiences. However, for developers creating VR games, the key question here today is how do we go from an older audience that likes non-VR games to one that is in VR as well? So looking into the research that my team has been doing, I think we've got a pretty good idea of how to achieve this. And frankly, it comes down to two items that will be familiar to the people who saw my talk last year. The first one is access. Last year I actually talked about accessibility instead, but I'm using access here as an umbrella term for concepts such as accessibility, but also learning, control, and safety. VR employs relatively new ways of controlling games, so these factors play a bigger role than they did last year for non-VR games. Then there's content. That's similar to last year. I also discussed there how to make games for older adults that are meaningful, that are interesting, and that are perceived as useful to them. And then finally, my third category is new. It's context, and this, because both previous factors rely heavily on social parameters, I felt that I should emphasize that, and I turned into a third section. So we're going to explore all three of these, and hopefully provide you with everything you need at this time to make great VR games for older adults. So let's start with access. So first, some hardware notes, I guess. Obviously, VR hardware differs significantly. And not all the recommendations that I'm going to make today apply to each of these systems. In fact, in my lab, we tried out the Gear VR, the Oculus Rift EK2, and the HTC Vive with older adults so far. That being said, when it comes to the hardware itself, we only ran into two minor issues. The first one being, with regards to the Gear VR, a few participants had poor eyesight, and we couldn't offer them a solution to see clearly in the device. Their glasses were either too big, or the optical adjustments weren't strong enough, and we were kind of caught in between those. So that's an issue that might occur with other headsets as well, but in the tests we did, it only happened with the Gear VR. So thought it was interesting to mention. Second, most of the participants that came into the lab were expecting something way more lightweight than what we currently have on offer, and something that's much more easy to use as well. So modern day headsets feel kind of bulky to them, especially the room-sized ones. And while it wasn't a huge issue for reasons that I'll explain in a bit, we did get some complaints about it, and I think it might get in the way of some people, investing in a VR system at this point in time. Now, moving from hardware to software though, all of the systems that we tested led to a number of recommendations that pertain to how our balance, our vision, our hearing, and our skills change as we age. So let's look at these, and I'll start with balance because a lot of VR seems to be heading towards embodied experiences. So balance is basically a function of three things. You got your proprioception, which is your unconscious sense of where the different parts of your body are in relation to each other. There's a vestibular system in your inner ear that provides you with a sense of balance and spatial orientation. And there's vision, and well, you guys are all using it right now, so I'm sure you are aware what that is. So these three put together allow us to move through spaces without falling over, but when they're out of sync, we tend to feel nauseous. For example, if your vision sees movement and your vestibular system doesn't pick up any, you might experience simulation sickness that VR developers have been working so hard on to avoid over the past years. Now, I'm not going to get into simulation sickness in this talk at all. I think it has been documented well, and there's many ways to avoid or circumvent it, in particular the things that you'll see on this slide. So with that being said, obviously there's way more to it than just these 5 bullet points, and I recommend reading the link at the bottom, which is an article by Ben Lewis Evans on Gamma Sutra that goes into depth in this topic. Now, for older adults though, we need to look further than this, and we need to be aware of the following. So proprioception, well, your nerve density in your peripheral nervous system starts to decline in your 40s. The nerves in your vestibular system decline around 55, and a lot of people will start to get vision issues, minor ones at first, after 40. You take all that, you combine it with your response times already being on decline after you hit 25 years old, and you can imagine that, well, as soon as you hit your 40s, you will see a steady decline in balance tests, and your balance will just deteriorate because of it. So to compensate for this, older adults rely more on their vision than on their proprioceptive system. And as you all know, vision is the thing that we're really going to be messing with when we're making VR experiences for them. So here is what I suggest we do. The easiest one, of course, is allow for people to sit down. We tried that in our lab. It worked marvelously. We just gave them a chair with wheels at the bottom, not a wheelchair, but just a chair with tiny little wheels. And it works fine for room-size VR like the Vive. We had people drive a chair through Paris, and they loved it. That being said, though, I think we need to, look, as an industry, look into how we can bring assistive devices into VR. You know, if the Vive tracker can bring in a gun or a baseball bat, well, why not a walking cane? And then finally, design for spotters. We helped with the cable management for our participants or provided them an arm to hang on to if they needed it. So keep in mind that older adults might need somebody else with them in the space to actually enjoy what you're developing for them. So that's my first point. Second, not everybody can duck, lean, and kneel efficiently like a younger person could. So the Fantastic Contraption actually does an excellent job with this by allowing players to scale the game world and play it in a less embodied way. In the standard scale, we had a lot of issues with our participants just getting down on the floor and trying to build the contraptions for the puzzles. But moving it to desk scale fixed a lot of these issues. So yeah, readjusting the scale can be very helpful. And then I have 3 recommendations that were less relevant in the short tests that we did, but that you will see if you have people play for a longer period of time. First of all, try to avoid movements that require balance shifting, because, well, that's asking for trouble, obviously. Second, implement enough resting time to accommodate fatigue. I'll have a comment about that later in the talk as well, but if you do an embodied game, you get way more tired than when you're using a controller. And recommend that players use a hard surface. We have a hard surface in the lab, but if you're playing on a carpet, it's easier for you to sway and fall over. So those are my recommendations for balance, and that will help us avoid any nasty falls, hopefully. Let's look at vision, hearing, cognition, and some other things. If you remember last year's talk, the reason why this is important is because surveys show that between 35 and 50% of 65-plus-year-olds reported disability. So this is a huge market segment, really, and they need some adjustments to play VR games. So for vision, well, a lot of the recommendations I made in last year's talk actually just carry over. They just apply to VR as well, like larger font sizes, higher contrasts. All these things are still very welcome. The specific recommendation that we saw is with devices like the Gear VR, if you can't see really well, you can sit closer to a screen, but that's difficult to do if the screen is stationary in front of you. So allowing options so that people can get closer to menus and to objects are really helpful. For hearing, again, a lot of optimizations like the ones we have for non-VR games. Make sure you're in the right frequencies, adjust words per minute, and so forth. But I think the biggest challenge for VR there are probably the subtitles. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of how this works, but if you just use typical subtitles like you'd have in a movie, it becomes very disorienting in VR. So the best solution that I've seen so far, I think, is the one that you have in Valve's tutorial. They give each character a speech bubble, and if you combine that with a visual indicator of where people need to look, I think that's probably the best thing that we've got so far until we see a better solution for it. So finally, we've got cognition and other adjustments. And a lot of these things come down to allowing for customization. From non-VR games, we have adjustments for slower reaction speeds or adjusting your input controls. And for VR, well, if you're using motion controls, allow older adults to customize how much leeway there is in the game's motion input, because they might need very coarse movements or they might have a tremble that you don't want to interfere with their input. Anyways, there's another Gamma Sutra article that goes into depth on all these topics if you'd like some additional information for it. So most of these recommendations are about adjusting the interface to meet the abilities of your players. And that brings me to a point that I made last year as well. You should always think about adjusting the interface, but never the challenge. Just look at this guy.
No tienes bala, dale un piñazo.
Dale un piñazo. Dale, que te está dando, dale tú.
All right. I would not want to pick a fight with that guy, and neither do you want to give him a less challenging version of the game just because he looks older than most of you do in this room. That's one of the reasons why the talk is called Beyond Ageism. There's no reason why you shouldn't expect older adults to be willing to get into a full-contact zombie battle in VR. So age does not necessarily make somebody frail or boring. So there are plenty of older adults who are still capable of getting into something like this. So I always say, adjust the interface, but please don't dumb down the challenge that you're providing. And that was actually my golden rule last year with regards to accessibility. However, for VR, I feel that I needed a different golden rule. And it's this. Since it's new technology, it is extremely important that you inform your audience what to expect. For example, for more physical VR games, you want to be careful with the motions that you're requesting of players, as injuries can happen. So it's essential that you indicate what these motions are going to be so people can make informed decisions before they buy your game and they really know what they're getting themselves into. Of course, that also means informing caregivers, and that brings me to a short anecdote from the study that we did. As we happen to have 2 people with mild cognitive impairment, which is an early stage of dementia, in our sample. Now, we didn't notice, and neither did our caregivers, until we noticed how they couldn't differentiate between the real world and the VR world, which, if you think of it, is really scary, because all of a sudden there's a real Tyrannosaurus Rex right in front of you. So we cut the demo short, obviously, but this is something to be mindful of, because well, there's a lot of ethical considerations with that, and MCI seems to show up even more so in VR games than in regular games. So those are my comments for access. Let's have a look at content. And I'd like to open that topic by addressing usefulness. Because if you think of games that are useful for older adults, you probably think of the brain games and the extra games. And if you were here last year, I really went on a rant about how brain training games are ageist because they're focusing on the negative side of aging and they exploit stereotypes and fear of aging for profit. Now, this argument can obviously be made for extra games as well. And well, the link down below refers to a lit review. The research on extra gaming for older adults is currently still inconclusive. We don't have enough evidence to demonstrate that they work very well. So with that being said, though, I do want to point out that, 1, older adults care a whole lot about spending their time in a useful manner. And 2, perceived usefulness for any audience is an extremely important concept in why people adopt new technologies, which is what we're dealing here right now. So my suggestion is here that as an industry, it's all about thinking about how we can make extra games and brain games that are not exploiting these things or using these stereotypes. And I think that's something we could reasonably do. For example, when I had older adults try a Space Pirate Trainer, which is awesome, many of them commented on how good of a workout it was, and the headset would just be covered in sweat when we took it off. Now, I can't academically back it up that this is a good exercise for older adults, but getting people to move and doing exercise that they usually wouldn't do is not really a bad idea, I would argue. So here is my approach on how to leverage usefulness as a design goal for older adults, and I talked about this last year as well. This is what I see in my research a whole lot. Older adults request innovative gameplay, thought-provoking themes, emotional, meaningful dialogue, and aesthetic experiences. Or like one person on Twitter put it, games that are really fun. And that's exactly what a lot of games that are designed for older adults are often still lacking. So let's explore some of the things that I saw in the games that we tested with older adults in terms of their content, and maybe this will inspire someone out there to make awesome extra games. So let's start with the #1 VR experience for older adults that's currently out there. It's Google Earth VR. And now I know, according to your definition, not a game, Bob. Well, according to mine, Google Earth VR is an exploration sandbox borderline VR game experience. And every older adult that we tested this with loved it. Now, aside from the obvious usefulness and educational value, what makes this so interesting, in my opinion, is that it's a reminiscing machine like nothing I've ever seen before. And reminiscing actually has a whole lot of positive health effects for older adults. So the takeaway here is that just by looking and exploring places, especially familiar ones, we actually have a very useful and meaningful mechanic for this audience. Now, that being said, this test was not all positive, though. The interface was still really cumbersome for people with little game experience, and they struggled a whole lot to move around. I actually had to put some people on the non-interactive welcome tour of the software, and they did enjoy that tremendously, but then you take the interactivity out of it. So perhaps there is an opportunity there for a guided tour VR thing for older adults, maybe. I don't know. And that brings me to a specific VR genre, I guess. I call it looking around games, and by this I mean experiences that are just about being somewhere else. Whether it's seeing a dinosaur come to life in Jurassic World demo, or visiting a Cirque du Soleil show, or seeing a blue whale pass by, just looking around works as a great mechanic for this audience. And from my experience, the cream of the crop would be games like Dumpy Going Elephants or Sideline the Chair, where your gaze is actually how you interact with the world. For example, Sideline the Chair, the game changes in the places where you're not looking. And my older adults mentioned that a whole lot as well. A lot of them mentioned that it was way more fun if there's some sort of an interaction in these games, whether it's just the environment responding to your presence, like fish swimming away if you get too close in the blue. Moving on, another demo that was really successful is this one in the lab by Valve. You get to play fetch with a robot dog, and that worked so well. I mean, when I did it, I got bored of it after 5 minutes, but my older adults just could do this for very long times, and I was really surprised at how much they got out of it. So the takeaway here is that building a social connection with a virtual or maybe real-life character is another mechanic that seems to work really well. Furthermore, when we think about learning VR games, this gameplay is extremely familiar and people figure it out without needing any instructions. So I would argue that designing for recognition is a great way to get older adults to learn your game faster. For example, in the fantastic contraption, to move from one mode to the next, all you do is you pick up a helmet and you put it on your head. And since it's a helmet, oh yeah, this is something I put on my head. In the lab itself, it's just a sphere. And it's the same interaction, but just putting a sphere on your head or putting a helmet on your head is completely different in the amount of help we have to provide older adults to figure out how the interface actually works. So recognition is really important. And these are my 4 main takeaways that work for every older adult that we tested with. So exploring places, reminiscing, social interaction, and recognition are important. Now, these are all recommendations for a general older audience. When I got my experienced group of older gamers, the Oxford Adult Gamers Club, in the mix, the design space just opened up. And the most popular game for that group was the Brookhaven Experiment. So a really tense zombie shooter game. Now, I do admit, in the test that we didn't have any female players come in. Sometimes we have them, sometimes we don't. So this might be a little bit gender biased, but the older adults that we tested these games with wanted something more action-oriented, and Brookhaven was a hit. They liked that it felt like an actual game, and that's a comment that I've heard a couple of times, while a lot of the VR things didn't really feel as much as a game. And they like to shoot and kill things. Whether it was the archery game that you'll find in the lab, the slingshot that you'll find in the lab, or Space Pirate Trainer, this is a mechanic that works for an older gamer audience. Now, obviously, I tried some other games as well. But I was really disappointed with how it turned out. I had such high expectations, but Job Simulator, the fantastic contraption, they liked them for a while, and they certainly got some laughs out of it, but they didn't really want to keep playing it like they did with the shooting games, and they felt in particular that the art style was too weird and too childish. So a more lifelike art style, like what you'll see in Valve's The Lab, works fine, but when you go into the really cartoony stuff, it's kind of off-putting for 60-plus-year-olds, I guess. So yeah, those are my notes I have on content, which brings us to context. Now, I'm nearing the end of the talk here, and we've actually already discussed a lot of social factors. For example, I talked about how spotters can help you make a game playable, how social interaction really matters. I hinted at the importance of intergenerational play, or how you want to inform caregivers about what to expect in a game. And aside from that, it really comes down to designing games that fit in the daily lives and the life history of older adults. And I would argue that there are very few differences there between VR games and non-VR games, so I addressed all of these pretty extensively in the talk last year. More specifically, we looked at 5 different motivational profiles. We looked at how you can extend MDA with aesthetics specifically for this audience. We looked at the life history boxes, the cost-benefits analysis of play, and how intelligence changes. So instead of just doing a complete rehash, I decided to provide you with a link of my talk last year on the wrap-up slide and simply get to my conclusion. So, in conclusion, I do see a bright future for VR for older adults. The way I think of it, VR is a transformative technology, similar to the internet or a smartphone. It's definitely going to change how we do a whole lot of things, and it's drastically going to change how we age. Correspondingly, I see a lot of opportunities for playful VR activities and games aimed at older adults, similar to non-VR games. But we have to be really mindful of their specific needs and wishes, and we still have a pretty long way to go to accomplish that. We're basically just at the beginning of this, obviously. So thanks so much for having me. If you liked the talk, please fill out the review forms, and I guess I'm ready for questions then. Thank you. Sure.
What would you think would differ for an AR HoloLens environment versus VR?
Well, with the HoloLens at this point, well, I haven't tested it at all with them, so it's a really hard question to answer because I hate just talking from my own experiences. For an yeah, I don't think I've got a good answer for that question at this point, actually. I think I really need to test it. Yeah, I'm just going to stay on the safe side of that one, sorry.
How about human factors, ergonomics, and hygiene? Have you looked at any of those in particular?
Well, in our lab, we typically look more into the content and go more in the accessibility. For ergonomics, I think it comes down to the things that I mentioned with the kneeling and all those things in the accessibility part of it. Those are the things that we could perceive. We don't do any formal standardized testing on those things. You know, with hygiene, we wipe off the headsets and everything because there's a lot of sweat oftentimes, especially with things like the Space Pirate Trainer. So yeah, that's, go ahead.
Great talk, thank you so much. I was wondering about how long onboarding tended to take in terms of sort of bringing someone, an older adult, up to speed on how VR, how the VR application was going to work.
Could you repeat that? Because I
Sure.
didn't get it.
Yeah, sorry. Just about onboarding. How long it took an older adult to get familiar with the hardware of VR and sort of what that, about how long that took you.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Average.
Yeah. So how long does it take for them to pick these things up, basically? Well, we always provide some assistance, obviously. But I have to say, Valve does a really good job with that tutorial. So we typically had them run through that first. And after that tutorial, they needed a little bit of help left and right. But it was way easier than what we get with most video games, non-VR games. Now with, say, the Gear VR, we had some extensive training for them. So, you know, we had like a protocol on how you put this thing on and everything. And we made sure that they're at ease and all that kind of stuff. So, because that was also part of a research study, so we had to do that. So with the Gear VR, the interface on the side could be a little tricky. It'd take them a while to actually just find that thing. But outside of that, I don't think we saw too many issues, like I said earlier. I mean, it's just, they get good instructions because we, you know, like I said, we're looking for content more than we are testing the hardware itself, I'd say.
Cool, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Hi. Again, great talk. Thank you so much. I guess I have an observation / question. Throughout my career in tech, not just in games, coworkers refer to grandma, like we want an interface that grandma can use, or saying, well, we're not looking for grandma to play this game. Also, I would observe that in articles that we see, and even in parts of your talk today, they're very stereotypically older looking adults who actually look more like 70 and 75.
Right.
Younger people might say, wow, look at the funny clothes, the golf outfits, how wrinkly they are, the white hair and so on. Wow, they're probably frail and tremble and stuff. But I think that distances us developers from them. That makes them more other. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that. My point of view is coming from that of a user experience designer and user advocate who is 52 years old.
Right.
And so I see a little bit of distancing, and I also see kind of a gap there between the 20-somethings and 30-somethings who make games and this notion that all these people are white-haired and frail.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Well, first off, in response, you know, with the visuals that are in the talk, I can obviously not use our actual participants for their anonymity and privacy, so I just pick things off the internet, and you do tend to get, you know, a very stereotypical image that way. It's just really hard to avoid. But with that in mind, yeah, I think last year I was talking about only 1% of the industry is over 50. It's, you know, I think there's definitely a disconnect there. Oftentimes we do things at Miami where we bring our students in on workshops where they have to design things intergenerationally. I think that helps a lot for the students that do that. It's, you know, the distance just becomes a lot smaller when you actually have to collaborate with somebody and make something that will work for both of you. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that. Does that answer you? Great. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm 72. This hasn't really turned into, as you've pointed out real well, into a mass market yet. Any additional thoughts on how to reach the seniors? For a younger generation, it's easy. They're reading gamer magazines. They're right in the middle of all that. How do you reach the senior population other than taking out massive ads and AARP?
Right. Yeah. Well, the AARP actually came up to me at some point saying they have a lot of people on the website looking for games specifically. I mean, they actually see this in their search terms apparently. Excuse me. But what I see with many older adults is that their online diet is slightly different. There are still a lot of people who use forums to look for games, while younger audiences typically, use things like Reddit. Facebook works as well. I think for my own research, it's always been easiest to find people through online communities to participate. Let's see. Well, I had another one, but it kind of escaped my mind for a second there. Yeah. Well, I think, the biggest one actually that always works really well, in my opinion, for us to reach out to people is if you can get their grandchildren to be really excited about something that they can do with their grandparents, it is really easy to get them to play. And that's typically, even when we recruit people for the Oxford Adult Gamers Club, we will just put an announce out in some local magazines that we know are read by 60-plus-year-olds. And we'll typically say, like, look, you want to know what your grandkids are so excited about? We'll teach you. And that helps us a whole lot with getting people to come over and try things out. But that's more at a local level. I think at an international level, online communities seem to be still the best way to do it. And there are actually some online communities that are specifically tailored towards older adults that play video games. There's an Australian website called theoldergamer.com. I've used that for my own research a couple of times as well. All right, any more questions? Great, well, I guess we're done here then. Thanks so much, guys.